All right, howdy friends. Russell here once again. In a previous video, actually the last video, we replaced the starter in my 96 XJ here because we had burnt it up while doing diagnostics for a crank no start issue. And I'll put a link for that video up here. Easy enough job to do. But what I wanted to do in this video is talk about kind of the diagnostics we did and show the parts that we had changed. A lot of times doing electrical diagnostics or no start diagnostics, multimeters, test lights, whatever get used. In my case, I've got a shop full of spare parts, some of them new, some of them used. So it was actually faster and easier to just start doing some part swapping. The symptoms we had was the starter would turn over, great. Motor was building compression, but it wouldn't start, and I could smell fuel in the exhaust. So going through diagnostic tree, the first thing you want for combustion, you've got to have fuel, air, and an ignition source, heat. So we got air. I was getting fuel, I could smell it in the exhaust, and then I also put a test gauge on the fuel rail to confirm I had fuel pressure. And then spark. I pulled a spark plug and then grounded it out, turned the motor over, and I was getting spark. Albeit it wasn't super bright blue, but I was getting spark, so the motor should have been firing. So from that, my diagnostics told me that we had a problem with the crank angle sensor. And if you've ever dealt with a Jeep YJ, TJ, or XJ, you know that the crank angle sensor is a bear to get to. It's mounted, and I can't even get a camera there to show you without being up under the vehicle. It is mounted through the bell housing, and you have to get at it from the backside. On an XJ, that means a swivel joint and extensions about that long to get up past the transmission to get to it. So we swapped out the crank angle sensor. Yeah, I can't even show you where it's at. We swapped out the crank angle sensor, and that made no change. The motor still wasn't firing. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to kind of adjust the camera and zoom it in a little bit, and I'm going to point out some of the things that we changed, and then I'm going to talk about what we actually found was wrong with it. So I got my handy dandy old nasty screwdriver here, but it lets me point. So like I said before, when you're dealing with no start issues, you got the three things you have to have combustion. You have to have air, you have to have a fuel source, and you have to have an ignition source. So in the case of an internal combustion engine, air comes in through the air box and throttle body. Fuel comes through the fuel rail, and the ignition source obviously comes from our spark plugs. So to check, obviously I had air. We had tried starting it, you know, opening the throttle butterfly just a touch to make sure we were getting good air in, and it wasn't an IAC issue. And I knew I had fuel. The fuel pressure port for testing it is right here. An easy way to test these, don't try this at home, kids, it's a Schrader valve. Is to actually just push on the Schrader valve real quick, and if you get a spray of fuel while the ignition's turned on, you got fuel. Don't do that on a hot motor because the exhaust is right under here. But I actually have a pressure gauge that we hook up to it, and I was getting good pressure. So I knew I had air, I had fuel. And I had pulled a spark plug and grounded the spark plug out while we turned the motor over, and I thought that I had spark. So we changed the crank angle sensor, which is mounted through the bell housing back here. On an XJ, you cannot get to it from the front. You have to come underneath, and it's just a pain in the ass. So, changed crank angle sensor, made no change. So the next thing I did, underneath this cover here, is the computer. I have a spare computer laying around. Swap that out, no change. So then, can't quite get to it. So then I changed the throttle position sensor right here. And that made no difference. Then I changed the manifold absolute pressure, or the MAP sensor. It's mounted on the 96. It's mounted on the throttle body, on the outboard side, underneath the air tube. All right, change that out. No difference. So then I changed out the idle air control. No difference. So that left us on the ignition side. Like I said before, I'd pulled a spark plug wire, pulled the plug out, inserted it, and held it grounded. We turned the motor over. I was having spark. So I'm thinking, great, I got spark. What's going on? Obviously, 96, it's not a coil-on plug system, but it is an electronic ignition. Inside the distributor is that electronic ignition module. It actually, on this motor, works as a crank angle sensor. I had a spare one of those laying around. Swapped them out. No change. All right. So we changed the spark plugs because the gap was pretty wide. Swapped them out. No change. So that left me with a cap and rotor, a coil, and plug wires. So let's go into what the symptom was. This motor would do this crank no start anytime we tried to start it when it was humid outside, like it was currently raining, or it had rained last night, come out, try and start it, or it was just really, really humid. We would get this crank no start. Sometimes you could work through it, it would start and run. Once you had it running, it would run great. So on a whim, so I don't know which one of those four, coil, plug wires, cap, rotor, it was. I said, screw it, we're going to replace it all. Got a new coil, new distributor cap, new rotor button, and a new set of MagnaCore wires. Swapped it all out, fired up, fired great. So here's where we're at. And obviously, you know, we burnt the starter up through all this testing, so we just did the starter. And, you know, the link was up earlier. Here's my thoughts on this, and it's my own fault. The distributor cap that is on this motor, I put on at about 190,000 miles. The vehicle now has 257,000 miles on it. It's one of those, we forget. Modern cars, you don't have to do this. Distributor cap, distributor rotor button, spark plugs on these cars need to be changed at 30,000 miles. So what was happening, this is a guess, but judging by the way the inside of the distributor cap looked, and if you've ever seen the inside of a distributor cap, 6-cylinder distributor cap, you'll have 6 brass or steel aluminum contacts. And then the rotor button sits on top of the distributor, spins around and distributes the spark to those contacts in the cap. Doesn't actually touch it though. There's a gap. So here's what I think had happened and why it only presented itself when it was humid outside. The gap between the rotor button contact and the distributor contact had grown so large that when it was humid outside, the arc across to make the spark wasn't strong enough. I was getting some, but it wasn't strong enough. And with this motor having upwards of 250,000 miles on it, the compression's not high enough. It needs a really strong spark to continue combusting and run. So after we swapped everything out, it runs like a top again. Like I said, that's conjecture, but based on my knowledge of MagnaCore wires, they don't wear out, not in 60,000 miles. And I doubt it was the MSD coil, but I can't count that out, so that got thrown in the trash. I think it was the gap between the rotor button and the distributor cap. So a note to self and a public service announcement: if you've got a distributor fired ignition system, make sure you're changing that cap and rotor when you do the plugs at 30,000 miles. If you like this content, go ahead and hit like, hit subscribe, hit that bell icon for future notifications, and as always, more to follow.